Welcome to the ARCO Forum at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government for another in our series on the crisis in America's families. This series is sponsored by the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, the HELP PIC, which is the student organization attached to the Malcolm Weiner Center, and this particular forum is co-sponsored as well by the Radcliffe Public Policy Institute. I'm Julie Wilson, director of the Malcolm Weiner Center, and tonight we're going to talk about one of the most pressing problems in America, the problem of teen pregnancy. We have a very distinguished panel, Kristen Moore, Peter Edelman, and Douglas Besheroff. I'll introduce them in more detail in a few moments. First, I want to just give you a bit of a roadmap for the week. This forum event is embedded in a series of brown bag lunches that feature people who run very innovative programs addressing teens, pregnant and parenting teens, and teen fathers. Earlier this afternoon, we heard from Harriet Meyer, who runs an Ounce of Prevention program in Chicago, and Lorraine Green of the I Have a Future program in Nashville. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, there's a program on teen fathers, and I'll give you more information on that later. And next Tuesday, we hear from people at Ohio's Learning, Earning, and Parenting program and Boston's Young Parents program. What we're trying to do is lay out the scope of the problem, talk about some of the policy issues, the debates, and then introduce people to some of the more innovative programs on the ground to see what we can all learn about this issue. If you go out into America's inner cities, if you go into the small towns and rural areas of our country, if you go into the suburbs, and you talk to people who are concerned about children, who are concerned about poverty, who are concerned about unemployment, about domestic violence and child abuse, or if you go into the academy and you talk to people who worry about social welfare policy and you say, what is the one thing you would want to change? If you could change one thing that you thought would help us solve most of these problems, what would you do? And I think almost everyone would say, eliminate teen pregnancy. We're going to hear more today about the negative consequences of teen parenting, but I think all of us understand deep inside that teens, particularly young teens, are still busy working on their own development and don't have the intellectual resources, the emotional resources, or the financial resources in most cases to begin raising the next generation. People working in child abuse, people working on welfare reform, people working in juvenile justice will often point to this same problem. Last year, more than 500,000 infants were born to teens, and more than 12,000 were born to teens under 15. This is a serious problem, a problem with enormous consequences. And our panelists are going to help us figure out not only how to think about it, but hopefully what we might do. Our first panelist is Kristen Moore, who is a social psychologist and executive director of an organization called Child Trends. This is always one of the wonderful things about doing forums, is you get to meet and talk to people whose work you've used as you've taught, whose work you've used in your research. And in the case of Kristen and I, we've talked on the phones many times, and this is the first time we've actually met as we've worked together trying to develop some evaluation materials for welfare reform programs. Kristen is one of the foremost scholars of teen pregnancy in America. Her work has been influential for many, many years, and she's on the forefront of a lot of what is going on. So, Kristen?
I wanted to begin our discussion with some statistics and trends so that the discussion would work from a common ground. And above you, and I hope I can see them, is a series of transparencies. And what I want to work from are some commonly held beliefs that I often find are affecting the debate, but they're not correct. Sometimes they're explicit, sometimes they're implicit, but it's really important, I think, that we are all talking about a common body of knowledge. And one of the implicit assumptions that I find is that rates and trends of teenage childbearing are similar to the United States to other comparable westernized democracies. People assume that, we're the United States, we're doing fine. But in fact, you'll see we're not doing fine. We're not doing just a little bit less well than other countries either. Our teen birth rate is astonishingly higher than other countries. You can see that Japan and the Netherlands are 4 and 6, and our rate is 10 times higher than some other countries. The other English-speaking countries seem to have somewhat higher rates, more comparable to ours, but we're twice as high as the second highest country, Great Britain. Our birth rate is 61 births per 1,000 teenagers aged 15 to 19, and it's an astonishingly high rate. Second, I often run into the assumption that the U.S. teen birth rate is high because of minority teens. And the next transparency shows data for several countries, and it shows the teen birth rate for black teens on the right, Hispanic teens second from the right, and U.S. white teens third from the right, and other countries are right on the left side. And you can see that even for white, non-Hispanic teens, the birth rate of 42 is much higher than it is in other countries. So although the birth rate is lower for white teens than it is for teens of color, it is still much higher for whites than it is for teens in other countries. The next transparency deals with the assertion that the U.S. teen birth rate is high, well, because U.S. teens don't obtain abortions, the assumption being that in other countries are relying on abortion to address their teen pregnancy rate. You can see on this chart that abortions are shown in red, and in green is the birth rate in these countries. Our abortion rate is higher than the birth rate in the other countries. We have a high pregnancy rate. We have a high abortion rate and a high birth rate. So all three of those, and we don't have a high teen birth rate because teens don't resort to abortion in this country. Teens actually have a very high abortion rate in the United States. Third, next slide. The teen birth rate is higher than it has ever been before. And this is a little bit complex because the teen birth rate, as you can see, has been rising. It increased by more than 20% from the mid-'80s to the early '90s. But it's not higher than it's ever been before. During the post-war years, teenage childbearing was extremely common. The difference is, you can see the next transparency, the change in the marital status of childbearing. The top line shows the total number of births to teens, and you can see that's not where the action is. The number of births to teens dipped a little and it's gone up a little, but it really hasn't changed all that much. What's changed is non-marital. The line going down is blue, is marital births to teens. The line going up in red are non-marital births. You can see that the lines actually cross, and now the very disproportionate majority of teen births, as shown in the next transparency, are to unmarried mothers. I don't think it's understood either how rapidly this change has occurred. In 1955, 15% of births to teens were outside of marriage. And in just a very, very short number of years, less than 40, it's gone to 71% of teen births being outside of marriage. Next transparency, though, shows that, again, it's a little more complicated than that. Teenage childbearing and non-marital childbearing are not the same thing. Non-marital childbearing has become more common among older women as well, and the most non-marital births are not to teens. In red, you can see 30% of non-marital births are born to teenagers. In blue, 36% are born to women who are 20 to 24. In green, 19% to women 25 to 29. And the over 30, where there's another inaccuracy, the idea that non-marital childbearing is common among older women, career women, and starlets. That's also a kind of a small group. It's in the 20s. But 70% of all non-marital births are to women 20 and older. Only 30% of all non-marital births are to teens. Next. The policy discussions about teenage childbearing often talk about teens as though they were a homogeneous group. And I think that is one of the problems we have in arranging for public policies in this country. There's an assumption that all teens are sexually active, for example, and that's certainly not accurate. Early in the teen years, sexual activity is really quite uncommon. By the end of the teens, however, it is normative or typical. The majority of teens are having sex by the time they've finished high school and are in college or working. There's quite a lot of transition during those middle teen years. And surrounding that, there's actually a fair amount of consensus. Past the age of 18, public opinion polls are fairly accepting. Below ages, well, at ages 12, 13, 14, 15, public opinion is also united, very much opposed to sexual activity for teens. It's in the middle to late teens, the high school years. There is true dissensus in this country about whether sexual activity is acceptable. Those are the very years where rates of teenage childbearing are increasing rapidly. Next is the belief that teens who become pregnant want to have babies. And I would say this is the single most common question I'm asked by reporters, the assumption that teens want to have a baby. This graphic shows the disposition of all pregnancies to teens. There's more than 1 million a year, but only 14% end in births that were intended at conception. Another 14% end in miscarriage, 35% end in abortion, and 37% end in birth, but births that were unintended at conception. So of all the conceptions to teens, you can see that the vast majority were unintended at conception. I think that has real policy implications. You know, are we trying to prevent something that teens themselves want, or are we trying to help teens do something that they themselves do not wish to do?
Is 1987 the latest data?
Isn't that remarkable? Yes. We'll have new data soon, but this is from the National Survey of Family Growth, calculations by the Alan Guttmacher Institute. Next graphic is, I think, another kind of implicit assumption regarding the racial disposition of young women who become mothers as teens. And in blue, the top shows that, in fact, 46% of all teen mothers were non-Hispanic whites. 29% were non-Hispanic blacks, and 22% were Hispanic. And then another 3% were from other race ethnicity groups. So the modal mother is non-Hispanic white. Hispanics, I think, are an increasingly large proportion of teen mothers in the United States, and the majority are not black at all. 7. And something that is now starting to register with policymakers is a very important fact, and that is that the majority of the fathers of babies born to teens are not themselves teens. 2/3 are 20 or older. And this graphic shows their distribution. And in red, you can see 65% are older. They're not all the, I should mention, by the way, they're not like, it's not that they're 40 and 50. They tend to be men who are in their 20s, late 20s, early 30s. But they're not high school sophomores, which also has fair implications for your policies. 8th, it's the contention that sex education causes teens to initiate sex. And I think this is a really widely held belief in the general public. It has, I think, affected discussions both at the national, at the state, and at the local level. There is a body of research now on sex education, which in fact does not show that sex education is particularly effective at preventing pregnancy or childbearing, but it does show that it doesn't increase sexual activity over levels that would have occurred otherwise, and that's really quite a consistent finding. So I think that's at least one fear that we can now put to rest. Next is a very similar concern, and again, if it were true, I think it would be a really legitimate issue, and that is that welfare is an important incentive for teens to have babies. And the facts are that the teen birth rate has risen during a time period when cash benefits have fallen substantially. And to me, even more telling is the fact that most European nations have much higher, more generous benefits for mothers and children and for unmarried mothers, and yet, as we saw earlier, their rates are much, much lower than they are in the United States, so that the two do not seem to somehow go together. In addition, there's a great deal of research that's accumulated to date, and it shows quite consistently that factors like poverty, family problems, role models, Those kinds of influences are consistently found to predict early childbearing, whereas literature on welfare is really inconsistent. When people find effects, they tend to be small, and many people do not find effects. So I would say that in my summary, you might say teenage childbearing, it might be on the list of causes, but it's way down on the list. The literature simply does not show that that is the reason that teens are having pregnancies. On the other hand, next graphic, it is the case that the majority of welfare recipients are teen mothers. Again, this is a little more complex than it might appear. The two little slivers show the numbers of the proportions of teens, current teens who are on welfare. And women who are 19 or younger clearly account for a very small part of the welfare caseload. It's women who were ever teen mothers who tend to accumulate on the welfare rolls because of their low educations, their difficulty in establishing marriages, and their larger family sizes. They tend to spend more years on welfare, and so they accumulate on welfare. However, it happens over a period of time, and only gradually do they become a disproportionate part of the welfare population. And last is another, I think, important part of this discussion is that people need to realize what's happening with the population of adolescents in this country. We've had a rising teen birth rate. We have, in the next decade, 1 million more young women are going to enter the kind of largest at-risk population, going from 7.1 million in this year, 1995, to 8.2 million in the year 2005. So I think we need to think hard about how to get our rate down, and we're going to have an increase in the number again.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Kristen. I've told Kristen one of her jobs is to keep us all honest. She's the keeper of the data here. Our next speaker is Peter Edelman, who is currently counselor to Secretary Shalala of the Department of Health and Human Services. He's played a key role in a number of the programs that they've initiated, including the prevention part of the 1994 Crime Act, empowerment zones, and national service. He is the substance abuse policy coordinator for the department and is currently overseeing the implementation of their community schools program and the Violence Against Women Act part of the crime bill. If you happen to be here for Donna Shalala's talk, we heard a lot about some of these programs when she was here. For those of you at the Kennedy School who are feeling quite sad that you missed out having David Ellwood or Mary Jo Bain and thought that Clinton drew only from Harvard, Peter is on leave from Georgetown University Law Center, so there are probably some pretty unhappy students there as well. He's been on the faculty there since 1982 and was associate dean for several years. Peter.
Thank you, Julie. I'm very glad to be here, very glad to see so many friends. That's a treat to come up here. The trends, as reported by Kristen Moore, I think show two different but interrelated problems. One is that we have a society-wide problem of unacceptably high level of unmarried teen births. And two is that we have a particular serious, critical problem of unmarried teen births among low-income young people. Just to add another number to the list that Kristen shared with you, 73% of the pregnancies that occurred among 15 to 19-year-olds occur in among low-income, that is poverty or near poor, 100% to 200% of the poverty line, poor or near poor, and 83% of the births that occur to 15 to 19-year-olds occur to low-income or to poor or near poor young women. So that dramatizes my second point. Sketching in broad terms, then, the answers have to come, I would suggest, in two forms, and we certainly can talk more about these as the evening proceeds, and I'll say some more about each. One is major changes in the life chances and preparatory support for self-sufficiency for low-income young people. young men and women, women and men both. And second, broad sketch, part of the answer, part of what we need to do, is to change the messages that we send as a society. The values that we're committed to and transmit in total, top to bottom, across the board, to all young people, about unmarried teen births, about responsibility, and I would suggest about sexual activity at unduly early ages as well. I'll talk more about both of these, but I want to mention at the outset two items, two categories that I think are not sufficient in themselves as answers. And I think this is borne out by the evaluation literature that we have, although the evaluation literature that we have leaves something to be desired. One is isolated or one-dimensional solutions or interventions. Strategies that are confined to classroom education or after-school sessions or public messages alone won't do the job by themselves. Not to say they shouldn't be part of a larger effort. Strategies that focus narrowly on reproductive health policy and contraception won't do the job by themselves. The other is welfare assistance, or the lack of it. That is to say, I would suggest that strategies that focus exclusively on reordering the carrots and the sticks presented by the welfare system will not do the job by themselves. Let me turn to my first broad point, life chances and preparation. This is not a program point. We don't just need to find the perfect program. There isn't one. We need to think strategically, systemically, developmentally, and not just preventively, but developmentally. We need to talk about life chances. We need to understand how much this is connected to economics. We've had bad economics, especially for minorities, young people trying to get into the labor market, get into adulthood, since 1973. We tend to forget, for example, that income in Afro-American families, income among black males, in fact, rose quite steadily from the late 1950s until 1973. But from 1973 to 1989, the income for the median male, this is white or black, of all races, who had 1 to 3 years of high school, this is in constant 1989 dollars, fell from $24,079 a year to $14,439 a year. That's somebody who has 1 to 3 years of high school, in other words, didn't finish. Even someone who had a high school diploma, over that period of time, beginning in 1973, the median income fell from $30,252 to $21,650. Now that's across the board, that's all ages, all races. Much worse for young workers, women or men. Worse yet for African American, Latino young people, and of course if you add the minority status to the lack of education, school dropping out, worse and worse and worse, men and women. So we start with a problem that, especially for young people trying to get into the labor market, we have a situation of not enough jobs, not enough good jobs, and really not enough jobs, period. And what it produces is a kind of a double whammy. Families don't form. There aren't, as William Julius Wilson says, enough marriageable males. That's one way to put it. We can begin to get into the sociology of it, if you will. The young women don't want the men are embarrassed, although I would hasten to say they shouldn't just walk away. That's the first piece. Families don't form after a baby is born. The second piece is that I think we have babies who are being conceived and born when they otherwise would not be, because it's instead of positive alternatives. It's not unrelated to the reason why so many young people are joining gangs. And again, we're talking about both female and male behavior here. And I would add, in terms of the economics of this, another thing to have in mind is the changes in the area of concentrated poverty. The between the years of 1980 and 1990, which I think bear on this question. The number of people who live in census tracts where there's over 40% poverty in this country rose from 1980 to 1990 from slightly over 5 million to slightly over 10 million. And I would suggest that the packing of all of those poor people into one place concatenates the problem. So one thing this is about is life chances. Economics are a key part of the picture. And the consequences of not having life chances are not just pregnancy and childbirth, but also dropping out of school, using and abusing and selling drugs, crime, violence, all of the things that my friend Lee Shore calls rotten outcomes. And all of these go up when there are insufficient life chances. Now, what prevents? Positive outcomes, jobs, opportunity, development. And prevention's really not the right word, because that prevents the negative. And what we want to do is promote the positive. And so what do? The heart of the strategy is what I call clear pathways. What does that mean? That means that young people need to be able to see that at the end of a road, there is a job or the possibility of going to college, whatever works for them. And they need to be able to see the road along the way, and there needs to be the road along the way to get there. It won't suffice if they are 17 or 18 and have no skills and someone suddenly comes along and says, here's a job for you. And so along the way they need the support and the preparation. And so you get someone who works in this field of teen pregnancy like Michael Carrera in New York City. And he works at it for a period of time, and over a period of time he comes to the conclusion that what I'm saying is what we need to do, that teen pregnancy prevention has to be comprehensive. So in the projects and the locations that he runs through the children under the auspices of the Children's Aid Society, we have education, we have recreation, we have health and mental health and reproductive health services, we have job club and job awareness, we have a lot of caring adults around. And we have an arrangement for college admission at Hunter College for kids who succeed. Broad. And in fact, people who do prevention find the same thing over and over again no matter what door they walk into the room from. They're working on substance abuse. Turns out if you want to be most successful in preventing young people, especially low-income young people, from getting into drugs, you're going to deal with them as whole people. Down in Texas, when 7 mayors 4 or 5 years ago wanted to work on crime prevention and started to form community-wide crime prevention planning efforts and brought people in from around the community, the discussion turned very quickly from solely law enforcement solutions, although they certainly improved their law enforcement efforts and engaged in community policing and were tough on public safety. But it moved very quickly to questions of comprehensive youth development. So if you go today to San Antonio or Corpus Christi or Fort Worth or any of those 7 cities, you will see that in the name of crime prevention, they are being comprehensive. And so as we look around the country, we want to look at things like community schools, which are developing in so many cities, which are comprehensive, keeping schools open, evening, weekends, summertime, bringing in families, lots of adult role models, the Beacon Schools in New York City, people like Jeff Canada in Harlem and Phil Koltoff with IS-218, another Children's Aid Society effort in the Bronx, El Puente, Luis Garden Acosta's effort in Brooklyn, and around the country. There's something called Walbridge Caring Communities in St. Louis, a very, very charismatic man named Khatib Walid who runs that. We've just had an evaluation that's come out. Some of you have undoubtedly seen it. It was Celia Duggar wrote about it in the New York Times about a month ago, of the Quantum Opportunities Program, which was funded by the Ford Foundation in 4 cities around the country. And what they did was to attach essentially a mentor, a caring adult, to a young person in the 9th grade and stay with them all the way through high school and a lot of other supportive activity and guiding them through till they got a job or till they got into college. And they was very rigorously evaluated. There was a control group as well as the experimental group, and very strikingly positive results in terms of the differences between the outcomes for the experimental group and the control groups. It's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of breadth, comprehensiveness, looking at young people as whole young people, in many cases with their family. What else goes into it? We need to start early. Kristen's just done a compilation of the research, and I was just reading it, and it tells us something that I think we already knew, which is that the kids who were involved in the Perry Preschool Project, which is the study that we always cite about Head Start, among other things, had better outcomes in relation to teen birth, teen pregnancy and teen birth. So we've got to start early. We've got to work at the community level and get all of the interests together to be sitting down at the table. It's very complicated because it's about how our schools work, it's about how our mainstream systems of service work, Job Training Partnership Act, and all of our employment efforts, and especially we need to reach out to the business community and involve the private sector and the business community all over this country. We can't do this with public dollars alone. We certainly can't do it with federal dollars, whether it's in the current atmosphere or even in a more auspicious one. And it's kind of disappointing to find out. I met with some people recently who had been down to the Atlanta Project, you know, President Carter's effort in Atlanta, which is quite interesting, and had been told that, you know, in each of the pieces of the city, there's been a partnership with a business corporation and a university in each of the neighborhoods. And so Delta Airlines had made its partnership, and my friend was excited. She thought she'd go in there and she would find out that they were helping kids to get into the job market, get jobs with Delta Airlines, right? That's what you would do. Well, it turned out it was a kind of a little tutoring program. Very, very token. And so we've got to get, I don't mean to pick on Delta Airlines. We flew up, not today, but earlier today I flew on Delta Airlines.
You won't fly with them tomorrow.
Right, not if anybody tells on me. Anyway, we need to reach the business community and say we need your involvement in a serious way to work on creating life chances, employment possibilities, moving kids on. The healthcare industry, we have some foundations working with the healthcare industry in a couple communities around the country on exactly that. We need to look at the question of discrimination that I'm afraid takes place in every city in this country against African American and Latino young people who are trying to get into the job market, which is an added barrier. That's all related to what we're talking about here. So we need to think strategically, systemically, developmentally, life chances, clear pathway. My second broad point, much more succinctly, is that this problem, as I said earlier, cuts across the whole society. We have to have change in values and norms across the board. I've had occasion to talk with people who are working with young people in communities as far-flung as the suburbs of Seattle, rural Oklahoma. In fact, just yesterday, that is when I flew on Delta Airlines, I was out in Oklahoma, and working with non-poor young people, young women, in communities that are entirely white, with very high rates of teen pregnancy and teen birth. And there's a lot of peer pressure, peer support, peer encouragement for those young people to have those kids. You know, they bring the baby to school and everybody says, kind of, I want one of those, they're cute. Now, why do we have this? Kristen said in passing about, what was it, rock stars and starlets, she said, yes. Well, I think we are sending some pretty lousy messages, and some of them are coming from the entertainment community and from other adults and through movies and television and music. We've had a decline of religion, I think, as a community force in people's lives. I think that might have something to do with it, but I don't know that we really know exactly why. I do think if we're going to succeed in changing the messages that are actually heard and received by young people, we've got to find some way to get into the peer culture and get young people to be sending the opposite message to other young people. It's really the same thing with drugs and underage drinking and binge drinking. We're not going to make headway, I think, until we can get young people themselves to change their own norms. And we can't just do it by lecturing and hectoring. So how are we going to reach? I'm really not sure, to be honest, but at least we need messages that are clear and coherent and consistent, that come from top to bottom, that come from across the board. This is something we ought to be able to agree on across philosophical lines, party lines, and we need strategies that cut across all sectoral lines within communities. We have states that have started to do that, North Carolina, Maryland, California. We need in those messages, I think, to stress the health consequences of unduly early sexual activity and pregnancy and birth, AIDS, the life consequences. It's not cool. Sense of responsibility. We need to find messages that will reach. And this is not just a poverty issue. This is a societal issue. We really have to change the value structure. Finally, Doug is going to talk about welfare. I don't want to spend time on that now. I've used up my time, but I do want to say that better welfare policy, I think, is part of the answer, but it's only part. And I do want to say that if all we do is change the welfare incentives by putting in more sticks without dealing with issues of life chances at the same time, I think we're just kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We can talk more about welfare later after Doug puts his cards on the table. I would just close by telling you about a young man that I met down in Fort Worth a year ago, and you will see that, if it isn't apparent already, that I actually give the same speech whether I'm talking about violence, whether I'm talking about drugs. There's some differences about the messages and so on, but it's the same thing. Murad Anderson was a 15-year-old young African-American man in Fort Worth who had written some poems that he gave me. And one of them, he said that he wished that he could get his grandmother off the West Side, get her away from all the gang-banging and all the drug slanging. And if he could do that, make her safe and end the violence, he said he wouldn't have a wish to wish. And I read that, and I thought that was good. And then I thought about it some more, and I realized that that was very distressing, because his only wish, the totality of his horizon, was to wish for an end to violence. So I think that what we need to do, and what I'm talking about, is to create the possibility that the Murad Andersons of our nation can really have a wish for a full and productive life, for opportunity, and to be a full part of our society with everything that it offers. Then he really would have a wish to wish. Thanks for the chance to be here tonight.
Thank you, Peter. Our third speaker is Douglas Besheroff. Doug is also a lawyer. He's in private practice in New York and Washington, D.C. He's currently resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research and is an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and a visiting professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs. Most of us know Doug from his work on child abuse, neglect, drug-addicted parents, but he's also done a great deal of work on welfare, lots of work on the issues of law and social policy, on poverty, and on teen pregnancy. We also discovered one unique fact about Doug when we were back in the holding tank signing papers, and that is that he's the only panelist who's not from Minnesota. So we'll excuse that. And Doug.
Thank you very much. Now, of course, that may be the problem, right, with welfare policy in this country. In fact, I'm from New York City, and it is a great pleasure to be here and to see so many familiar faces. Peter and I did decide to divide the territory with him speaking first about opportunity. I feel as if I'm being attacked by these little fellas. And me talking about welfare to start. I'm not sure whether that's a reflection of what's going on in Washington, with the administration saying to the Republicans on the Hill, well, you tell us how you want to do welfare reform, and then we'll comment on it. But we did it that way. But I did want to spend a minute or two of my time to emphasize that I agree with Peter wholeheartedly about the connection between opportunity, or at least perceived opportunity, and all sorts of reckless behaviors. There's no doubt in my mind, from looking at the data and from talking to young people, that a perception of better opportunities is not only the best contraceptive, it's the best prophylactic. And we should not forget that. If I differ with Peter, it is because I wrote down the phrase comprehensive youth development and put a few question marks around it, and I said, my God, I'd settle for some good high schools. I'd settle for some schools that show by their curricula and by the jobs that their graduates get that it pays to stay in high school. I travel to too many inner city schools that are comprehensive this, holistic that, and so forth and so on, and they don't teach the skills that those disadvantaged young people need in our economy. My hometown of Washington, D.C., that's what I call hometown now, there's only one way to get the D.C. public schools to teach you WordPerfect 5.1 and other office skills. Only one way. You drop out of school, have a baby, go on welfare, and if you're lucky, you'll get in a job training program that teaches those skills. Ounce of prevention people, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And yet they use precious teaching time in D.C. to require every student in the school system to take an SAT preparation course, even though 55% of the entering freshmen drop out of high school before graduation. Forget about going to college. We have to be clear about the best kinds of opportunities for these kids and offer them. But having said that, by the way, UPS, Baltimore, training for real jobs. So the next time you have to travel, get in a little box, and UPS will deliver you. Now, I am supposed to talk about welfare reform. And Peter, in his construction, was very careful to say welfare reform can't do it alone. The obverse of that is that opportunity strategies can't do it alone. I think the reason is that, as William Julius Wilson from the University of Chicago has put it, in many of these communities, the behaviors we're most worried about have taken on a life of their own. There is a dynamic now in place that goes beyond simply the question of whether there are jobs. If that weren't the case, the I Have a Dream programs would have tremendous impact, because they take young people and they say, you're guaranteed college, you're guaranteed all the supports that are necessary. That guarantee of opportunity doesn't seem to be enough. So I think we have to do something more. Welfare is one of those places. I want to spend 30 seconds somewhat disagreeing with Chris Moore. I think I would put a slightly different spin on the question of whether the research shows that welfare has an impact on out-of-wedlock birth rates. I think the most recent and most sophisticated work shows that among white women, welfare has a measurable, though relatively modest impact. The evidence is much more mixed. Would you like the microphone? Okay. The evidence is much more mixed about African Americans, but all this research is extremely difficult to do. It's based on studies that look at variations in welfare grant levels, often just the cash grant level, not food stamps, housing, and so forth, and not in the context of the reality that Peter mentioned, which is a 20-year decline in the earnings prospects of high school graduates. So when you look at welfare payments and look at them as a variable for creating a pull towards illegitimacy or a baby out of wedlock, one has to factor into that the declining incomes of the people involved, so that welfare begins to look more attractive. That's not done in the work. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's grant that one can't establish a connection between welfare and illegitimacy. That doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't address the one with the other. Because, as Chris mentioned, a substantial portion, in fact now 60% of the children on welfare are children of never married mothers. That's 50% higher than just 20 years ago. The shape of welfare is changing because of never married kids. And we're spending $50 to $100 billion a year on welfare programs, depends on what you count. And whether or not those welfare programs lead to illegitimacy, certainly we ought to ask, what could they do to discourage illegitimacy? And I think the answer right now that almost everyone would give, I won't say everyone because I'm not sure about the people to my left over here, I think almost everyone would say that right now welfare does nothing to discourage teenagers from having a baby. So I have the thankless task in 10 minutes to tell you what welfare could do to discourage out-of-wedlock births. I mentioned 3 things. First, I think that welfare can be used to do what Peter asked, which is to reestablish the morality of responsible parenthood, and I'll talk about that in a second. I don't think, Peter, that you do it only by having young people get together and do some values clarification. I think the grown-ups in society pass some rules. I have some rules at home. My daughter is not here, so I can speak freely. The towels have to be picked up. The room has to be relatively clean so a vacuum cleaner can fit on the floor to do its work and so forth. There are no values clarification in my household about those kinds of things. About other things, yes, not those. Second, I think you have to raise the opportunity cost of being on welfare. And third, and most complicated, and which I'll need the most time about and I won't have, is I think we need to accommodate child support rules to the realities of welfare families. Okay, reestablishing the moral clarity of responsible parenthood. During the Great Depression, when a lot of Americans were very poor, we collectively slowed down having babies. It didn't take a government program or anything. People just said, we don't have the money, we're not able to take care of the children we bring into the world, we won't have them. We've lost that sense. And there are poll data, and if it weren't so late, I'd give you some numbers too. But there's poll data about the feeling about when someone should have a child, whether having a child is a sign of great personal responsibility or obligation, or whether it's just one of the things you do. My mother is 82 years old. She was at a bus stop waiting for a bus and sitting next to a young girl who was pregnant, and somehow the conversation came to this or that, and the young girl said, "Oh, I'm not married." And my mother said, "Why not?" And she said, "Oh, I'm not ready to get married." And we have reversed, as a society, the question of which comes first. What takes a greater adult commitment? Now, as the parent of only 2 children, and, you know, marriage is tough, but having kids is also, we've lost that. We've lost that. Now, the first place you want to find this, I suppose, is in our social institutions like churches and so forth. The problem with that, from my own personal experience, my church, I know, is against nuclear holocaust. And I know it's against homelessness. But I think we're soft on adultery. And we are certainly soft on out-of-wedlock births. And I say that because it's never talked about. And you read the literature about what's going on, for example, in black churches, and this is a terrible problem. They don't know how to address this problem. When 67% of your congregation or higher is having babies out of wedlock, you cannot stand up and say it's a sin to have a baby out of wedlock. You simply can't do it. Well, where does this take you? When Bill Clinton was in inner city Washington talking to a group of high school students, he said, you know, less sex, more protected sex, less babies out of wedlock. It was covered in the press. One of the reporters who was there called me and said, the students snickered. What do you do about that? Well, I think welfare could help. I think a series of welfare rules that sent a signal about how adults feel about this issue would be very important. A good place to start, I don't know what the number is now, but as recently as 10 months ago, 11 states provided fertility drugs to women on welfare. Not birth control, fertility drugs. I'm no expert about fertility drugs, but my understanding is that when you use them, it's quite likely that it is more likely that you will have 15 children than 1. Now, I don't understand why we should provide fertility drugs to women on welfare. Now, that would be a simple thing. I also don't understand why It is not government policy to provide family planning and drug treatment programs when we have women of childbearing age. There's an absolute hostility to doing it. Now, why is that? Well, I said I didn't know why. I actually know a little bit why. We have a problem with the left and the right. The problem from the left is we've had 20 years of an abortion debate which has, I think, confused reproductive rights with the rights to reproduce. And we've gotten confused about a woman's right to choose to go to term with whether people should have children regardless of whether they can take care of them. And you see that in the debates today. And from the right, we have confused it in the other direction, which is many people are deeply concerned about abortion and think it's a sin, but somehow that has spilled over into the question of contraception, even though there are vastly more Americans who support contraception. The politicians, the bureaucrats, seem to be immobilized when it comes to providing contraceptive aid. So I think it's a problem from the left and the right. In this regard, I would say that as long as they're not too stringent, the notion of a family cap, which is a signal that says if you have an additional child on welfare, we're not going to raise your payments, as long as it's not punitive, sends exactly the same signal. We want in everything we do to send a signal that the larger society thinks it's not that you're a sinner, it's not that you're morally wrong, it is that you shouldn't be having babies out of wedlock. By the way, on these family caps, for those who think that they may be harsh and punitive and so forth, I'd be willing to take all the money we have now and start welfare families at a higher level of payments. It shouldn't be a question of saving money. We should just take all that money and say, all right, it's like in a firm. We would say, okay, everyone's going to be paid a certain amount, whether or not you have more kids. We're not trying to save money. What we're trying to do is make our system neutral to the question of whether you have more children. Raising opportunity costs is the second thing I wanted to say. Look, I would put a slightly different spin on Chris Moore's data. More than half of the babies born out of wedlock in this country, more than half, are either first, second, or third babies born to women who had their first baby as a teenager. So the number's a little stronger when you think of it in those terms. Most of the young women who are on welfare long-term are either high school dropouts or, if they graduated high school, did not do well enough to have a high earnings capacity. For them, the reality is that a life on welfare is better for their children, and better for them than a life of work. Total payments are about the same, maybe a little higher on welfare, maybe a little lower, but mom doesn't have to leave the house at 8 a.m. and leave her children with strangers. She doesn't come home at 6 or 7 o'clock at night, dead tired. The deal, when we stand up and say, well, why don't these young women choose to work, that's not the right deal. So we have to change that deal. Now, on the left, the way to change that deal, in fact, on the left and the right until November, the way to change that was to chase after what I think is the ultimately futile approach of trying to raise the earnings capacity of someone who dropped out of high school so that it is higher than what she'd get, that subsistence amount we give her on welfare. Losing proposition. And that's why, since November, the argument has been about pushing those young mothers somehow into the labor force. Here, I think you're going to have one set of rules. My own feeling about this is it almost doesn't matter what you do as long as, number one, you respect and cherish her role as a mother. So it doesn't have to be full-time. It doesn't have to be 8 in the morning to 8 at night. But that it does something so that she feels she might as well get a real job as opposed to being on welfare and then get on the ladder to success. The last thing I said I wanted to talk about, and really is the most complicated, is to accommodate child support enforcement rules to welfare realities. When Bill Clinton spoke at his first State of the Union address, the loudest round of applause was when he talked about deadbeat dads. The Republicans and Democrats, with a few exceptions, are rushing to get tough on child support enforcement. We are in the Kennedy School of Government. Let me tell you one of the primary rules of public policy analysis. Whenever the left and the right, the Republicans and Democrats, agree about something, be suspicious. Because what it means is no one is providing critical analysis to the issue. No public policy issue that is so obvious would fester for so long. The reality is that young mothers on welfare do not marry lawyers, doctors, or accountants. They marry, they don't mate with lawyers, doctors, or accountants. They mate with young men in their neighborhood. As Chris mentioned, many of them are a little older. These young men do not have enough money, do not earn enough money to take their families off welfare. It makes good sense for that individual, that man, not to step forward and provide support if the current welfare rules say that every dollar he provides, except for the first 50, goes back to the taxpayers. I spent a day at Cabrini Green about 6 months ago talking to welfare mothers, and I asked them, how many of you have the father of at least one of your children at home? It was about a third to a half, maybe a little higher. And I asked them, what would happen to your family income if that father of one of your children paid child support or was known to the authorities? And they said, our household income would go down from a third to a half. Why in the world should we expect minority communities to support child support enforcement efforts, which they will not do when that is the reality? So the third thing that I would say is if we want to make some progress on child support, we're going to have to do something to let the children in those households benefit from the child support payments that those fathers who happen to be living at home would be willing to make. That will be hard to do, but there are proposals. There was a provision, one of the provisions I liked most in the Clinton bill, as a matter of fact. See, I got to say something I liked in the Clinton bill. There was a provision in the Clinton bill that let states allow mothers to keep, I think, up to 50 or 70% of those child support collections as a way to test this proposition. It's a very serious one because maybe unlike my colleagues, I do think these rules can have a devastating impact on the least powerful among us. This, through welfare, is how we speak to the disadvantaged in our most formal way, and we have to clean those rules up. One last point, my time is up. We may argue a fair amount about these issues. But I want to get my 2 cents in. There's no doubt that these rules will have an effect on questions about early sex, protected sex, abortion, and adoption. How much of an impact will depend on how tough these rules are. If they're too tough, if they're harshly punitive, they will have a bigger impact than if they're more modest. The policy process has to fine-tune this to get the signal about right without causing too much harm to the children and families involved. That's not going to be easy because in the political process in the Congress, things are done at much more abstract levels. So for myself, I'm not prepared to judge whether we should do these things till I find out what the actual penalties are. But I know we're in the right playing field if we get it right. Thank you very much.
I'm going to give the first 2 speakers a chance to talk to Doug and Doug to respond while people are lining up. There are 2 microphones. Feel free to line up. We'll take questions alternately. And all we ask is that you give your name, your affiliation, and limit yourself to a question as opposed to a speech. Okay. Kristen or Peter, do you want to comment?
Why don't we open it to the audience?
Okay.
Oh, you're
Okay.
already ready.
They've
They're not
decided
gonna
they'll
talk.
open it up to the audience.
Okay, I'd just like to make a comment on the point about raising the opportunity costs. And again, this sense that I think that Kristen couldn't cover with her statistics, but I think also is a bit of mythology that encases this debate. I'd give an example here in this state last year where the question of opportunity costs versus a willingness to go out and work rather than stay on welfare, there was a situation where women in this state applied to the welfare office for daycare vouchers so that they could either attend school or go to work. This state replied to them by saying, I'm sorry, but the money's run out for that program here, even though the jobs legislation in Washington says you must provide it if a woman wants to do that. This state said no. It went to the state Supreme Court, and within 4 months, the waiting list for that had grown to 1,800 women. by the time the court had to resolve it and say that the state had to provide the daycare to allow these women to do it. I'd like some response to this question about raising the opportunity costs and this sense that we seem to believe that these women do not want to be out there and working or getting the kind of training, in reflection with the current package you see down in Washington right now.
Is that directed to me?
It could be.
Let me start by saying that I was a welfare recipient myself once. Myself, not my mother, and that I understand the dynamic involved here very clearly. When I was in law school, I was working full-time against the ABA rules, but I was working full-time because I needed to pay for my tuition. Then they changed the Social Security rules when my father was dead, and survivors, and they said if you are under 25 and a full-time student and earning less than, I think it was $1,600 a year, the federal government would give you $1,200. You know what I did the week after I found out that they would give me $1,200 if I quit my job? I quit my job. Now, I don't think I was being immoral. What I did was I quit my job and I started studying harder, and I think it made some impact. So my judgment here is not about people's desire to work. We know, for example, that about a third of the women who are on welfare regularly try to get off by taking a job. I'll get to the child care thing in a minute, but we know that they try. We call them cyclers now. But what happens is they go out there to a job, they get a job, and a week or two later they get their paycheck, and they realize they're worse off in the labor market than they would be at home on welfare, being able to work on the side and so forth. So the way I would answer you is I think of welfare recipients in three broad categories. Top third, who are dying to get out there and work and might need some help through child care. A middle group who, even if you provided child care, wouldn't be earning enough so that it would make it worthwhile. And I don't find that immoral. I felt the same way. And then a third group whose earnings would be so low they don't even consider work. Now, for the middle group especially, if you don't provide child care, there ain't a way in the world they're going to go out and try to find work. So on that part, I agree with you. I don't know about the details of funding here, but that's how I would try to understand that situation.
We ought to understand that in some states in this country, in Mississippi and Alabama and Texas, what you get is a combination of welfare and food stamps brings you up to less than half the poverty line. So we have some serious questions about how easy it is to survive on welfare. We have said for many years, and I don't see why, I mean, Doug, you said it's ultimately futile to try to raise the earnings capacity of I think I wrote that down. We've thought for a long time, and it just seems to have changed recently, that the way in which you could, I don't know what's the top two of your three tiers, that a rational way to arrange things is that you try to deal with the earnings question, and so we increased the earned income tax credit in 1993. You ought to make sure that health care continued to be available, so that Medicaid should continue on some transitional basis. We tried to enact health care reform. That didn't go so well, but there's still a question about continuing health coverage and the question of child care. A lot of this is, not all of it, because you also said, Doug, and I agree with you, that one of the things that's happened, unfortunately, is that for whatever reason, and it's a long debate, that behaviors have taken on a life of their own. That's the phrase you used, and I actually agree with that, although we have to have a little negotiation about exactly how to apply it. But apart from that question, you're talking about how do you make it so people are better off working than they are on welfare. Now, one way you can do it is you can just say, regardless of whether you play by whatever rules we set up, we just think we only owe you as a society 2 years of help or 4 years of help for your lifetime or whatever it is. And then you're gone. And we're not interested in what the labor market's like. We're not interested in whether you can find child care. We're not interested in whether there's going to be any health care coverage for you. I don't think that that's a very thoughtful way to approach it. And it seems to me that what we ought to do is, as soon as we can, get back to the discussion of what's the relationship between what you get if you stay home and what you get if you go to work. And it is certainly true that there are places in this country where, as a consequence of the weakness in the labor market and the relationship to what we pay on welfare, which is not very generous, you are, by the time you pay all the costs of working and by the time you pay the child care, if you assuming you can find it, and so on and so forth, you're worse off working. You're absolutely right about that. But I don't think we're having a very thoughtful debate about how to connect those two situations to one another.
Well, except here tonight, where we're having a very thoughtful debate.
Oh, absolutely.
But
out there.
a few numbers. The national averages on the total benefit package, which would include AFDC, food stamps, and if we're thinking about long-term welfare recipients, housing, about a third of all welfare recipients and about 2/3 to 3/4 of long-term recipients get housing, and Medicaid comes, national average is $17,000 a year. Subtract out Medicaid because those families really don't see that, and you're still talking around $12,000 or $13,000 as the average national package for benefits. And the problem is, if we're talking about young women who dropped out of high school, and I'm going to talk about another group because what we're talking about is different groups of women who are on welfare. If you talk about high school dropouts who have had no children, who did well in school and so forth, high school graduates, they only earn about $15,000 independent of all this welfare. The fact of the matter is, in our society, if you've just got a high school diploma, it's real hard to earn enough money alone as a single mother to take care of 2 kids and pay for child care. It doesn't work. That's why I called it feudal for those women. It is no accident that the median income for female-headed households where the mother works is around $23,000. That's about what it takes to escape welfare. It's like the escape velocity, right, when you're leaving planet Earth. That means the women who leave welfare start off with much higher human capital. They tend to be the divorced women who finished high school, maybe had a few years of college, had some labor experience, job experience. They can go out and command to start $17,000, $18,000 a year. They can see $21,000 in a year or two. They're the ones who are leaving right away. And our objective has to be to facilitate that, not screw that up, but also work on those women who will never, I'm sorry, we don't have the technology to take someone who dropped out of high school and get her earning $22,000 a year. We can't.
But what's your, I don't get what your answer is, Doug.
Wait a minute. First, accept that that's the problem. Then we'll start looking for an answer. But
Well, I will take it we accept that it is a problem. I want to let these other folks ask questions here, but I take it we accept that it is a problem that a young woman, who has not graduated high school and has no skills, particularly in this labor market, is going to find it difficult to find a job that, with all the costs of working, given the lack of subsidy for child care and that the job is likely to be a secondary labor market job that provides no health care benefit, that she's unlikely to be better off working. That's your point?
well, I wouldn't stick in those other social programs that you're trying to slide in, but sure, go ahead. All of that, yes.
Okay, then I want to know what your remedy is.
One part of the remedy here is to discourage too early or too irresponsible births, which is to say, that's why I spend a lot of time worrying about the sexual practices of teenagers. That's why I spend a lot of time worrying about contraceptive practices, why we have to be concerned about
And
questions.
how are we going to, I'm sorry, Tim.
How do you deal with
yeah,
that?
Yeah, I'm taking you to the next step.
Well, I think there are other people who want to talk, but I could give you a speech about that as well.
Well, maybe we'll hear from the other people, but I think we need to come to some closure about what it is that we want to say to those young women who haven't yet had children through the welfare system.
Don't have a baby.
Yes, through the welfare system. I want to say don't have a baby, and I made some suggestions about that. And I want to know what you want to say through the welfare system about don't have a baby.
I want to say that if you have a baby and you can't support it yourself, after an appropriate period of time, you're going to have to be someplace 5 days a week, like 70% of all other American mothers. Not 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Maybe we'll just require that you volunteer at a Head Start center for 3 hours a day. I think that's enough raising of the opportunity cost. Oh, I'm happy to provide daycare. I'm happy to talk about that too.
Well, all
I'd
right.
like to comment, though, because I think that the idea that has been sold to the American public is that we're going to save a lot of money doing this. And I guess if you do cutoffs, you can, but not if you consider the outcomes for the kids. I mean, if you are thinking about the next generation of children, it's a lot, it's millions of children who are on welfare who are potentially affected by this. And I guess what concerns me is in part the well-being of those children in and of themselves, but also if I were going to prevent teenage childbearing, one of the first things I would want to do is think about children at a very young age and the trajectory in which they are being set. And so some of the cutbacks concern me, and I'm speaking from the research, I'm not trying to just give my personal opinion, that early interventions for children which enable them to start school ready to learn and healthy and get them on a trajectory in school are one of the things I would want to do based on the literature to prevent teenage childbearing. So I think we have to think about the outcomes for both generations.
Okay.
Mr. Edelman, my name is John Simon, by the way. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. Your comments, I think, were characteristic of the Clinton administration in that you talked about many, many comprehensive, complicated programs. And while I think this is a problem that is very complicated and requires several different solutions, you failed to identify, in my mind, where the rubber meets the road in terms of what if you could do one thing, what would be the one thing you would do given the political realities of the current situation. I'm not talking about the Republican Congress, but given that you cannot get massive comprehensive programs through Congress easily. And if you could get one thing through Congress, what would that be and how would it cost?
This is not a question of getting things through Congress. Okay, we really have to be very clear about that. This is a question of what we do in communities around the country. And I'm sorry, there is not one thing. And we really have to understand that. If we're going to produce kids who grow up to be productive citizens, we have to make arrangements through federal appropriations, state appropriations, major private sector involvement, all of us being involved, and Doug's absolutely right when he's talking about the mainstream schools. I said that in passing, but his calling attention to it, I want to say I completely agree with. We can't make our schools work, we're not going to win on this. Don't do this one thing stuff, okay? You don't get there. You can't get there from here with one thing.
I wonder if we get anywhere with this many thing type approach. It seems to me that's a recipe for
you and I would have to have a longer
procrastination.
conversation because I just want to tell you as clearly as I can that there's no one thing stuff in this. Okay, it's not about the Clinton administration. Sorry I use words like comprehensive, you know, that's too many syllables.
Whoa. What would be the first thing then you would do?
The first thing I would do is invest in kids.
That means
That is vague.
Hmm?
I'm sorry, that's vague.
Oh, okay. Well, then I would invest in prenatal care. I would invest in Head Start. I would invest in early childhood development. I would invest in elementary and secondary education. And I would put some advocacy effort into changing structures. You can't just do this with money. Doug is absolutely right. We have schools in this country that don't teach. That's not about the D.C. schools have got money coming out their ears. Okay, they're the worst, but there are school systems around this country that are also have very, very serious problems. Absolutely. I don't want to be vague. But I'm also not going to say one thing.
Well, I agree with that.
Oh, okay. But it's not your turn.
Okay.
Yes, a lot of people talk about solving welfare problems through jobs, job creation, job this, job training, job that. Economists talk about the natural rate of unemployment being 5 or 6%. Where are these jobs? Do they exist for these people to get off of welfare and to get onto these jobs, or where are they?
Well, the problem is there are jobs. There are a lot of jobs. They just don't pay enough for a single woman to raise 2 children. That's why, and I concur here with what the Clinton administration said in introducing its welfare bill. If you look at, for example, the millions of new jobs that have been created in the last 10 years for immigrants to our country, you can't look at that job creation without realizing that we're generating lots of jobs. The problem is we're generating jobs that don't pay enough for a single, I keep saying this, I'm like a broken record, a single woman with a mother with 2 children to live. There are loads of jobs at $6,000, $10,000, $11,000 a year. That's not what she needs without tremendous amounts of government support.
This is a really hard question. I mean, I don't think there are enough jobs out there. And we have had, the reason why we've had these income declines that I cited in my talk is because there's tremendous weakness in the labor market. I mean, there's all kinds of data on this. CDF has put out 2 publications with Andy Sum from Northeastern called Vanishing Dreams, in which they've documented the plight of young families. So it does seem to me, and here we get into human capital development and labor market economics, that if you invest more in appropriate education and training, and you have more people in a labor force who are ready to work, well, I can't prove it. I think, in fact, you'll get some outcomes in the economy where you actually do get more jobs available for one reason or another, whether it has to do with jobs not going offshore and things like that.
What do we do in the meantime then when states want to cut off benefits after 2 years and that's not going to be enough time to train people
I
or
mean,
to create these jobs?
let me say that if you look in cities around this country, if you look at all kinds of construction jobs, you look at trade unions and who they're still taking in after years and years and as apprentices and what color they are. And if you look at the questions of where jobs are locating, because they're pretty systematically moving away from central cities, if you look at a lot of patterns about where jobs are and where the hiring is being done, the hiring is not equitably distributed. So at the very least, I would say, well, it's difficult to accomplish in terms of public policy. At least we could point it out that the jobs that we have available are not being equitably distributed.
But you said something about the 2-year rule, and I know other people want to speak, but I feel constrained to mention. We are in this political context in which time limitation of welfare benefits has taken on tremendous political support. We should remember where it came from, unfortunately, which was Bill Clinton and the last presidential campaign. There are many of us who feel, as I tried to explain before, some of these women will never be able to support themselves. And so you don't hear me saying 2 years and 0, but we are in a situation in which we had a successful presidential candidate kind of fertilize public opinion with the notion that we could have 2 years and out. Now, he mumbled something after that about, and then we'll give you a public service job and this and that, but what people heard was 2 years and you're out. And that's been terribly harmful to this debate.
Yeah, I want to add to that too. That I think that it's not just a discussion about women, but men. And artificial insemination is very uncommon among young mothers, very uncommon. And the fathers they're not sophomores, and most of them are. Yes, they're disadvantaged and their earnings prospects are poor. But if we're thinking about workfare for mothers with very young children, I think we need to think about workfare for fathers. I don't mean to be overly sanguine about child support. We know that it's difficult to pull off, but I think it's part of the message that needs to get sent. I think we need to figure out how to create disincentives for males as well as females. It's part of that, and as time passes, the incomes of these fathers do rise. And so combining child care, health care, the earned income tax credit, and some kind of earnings from these fathers as well, whether it's from employment in the private sector or whether it's from some kind of supplied job. There may not be jobs, there's a great deal of work to be done.
I think that the point that Doug made earlier about some incentive for some of the child support collection to stay with the family would make some sense.
Yes, I really agree.
Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time for questions, but I know people will stick around for a few minutes to talk. I'd just like to in closing, to thank our panel. This has been one of our more thoughtful and provocative discussions, I think, in the series. And to announce for those of you who want to continue hearing about teen pregnancy and what's being done to try to address it, tomorrow at 1 o'clock in room 140 in this building, Michael O'Neill, who's the Executive Director of Young Fathers, Inc. in Roxbury, will be here to talk about what's going on for young fathers. And Tuesday next week, April 18th at 4 o'clock in the Fainsod room, which is upstairs, I think it's labeled Faculty Common Room, there will be another brown bag talking about what's going on in Ohio, the LEAP program, and what's going on in Boston. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Yes, this is during the